We do have the sixth mountain today. We've been on our journey. I guess I should get my walking stick here just for a moment so I don't trip going up this mountain. My safety officer is here. We've had a good journey from a wide variety of mountains, high mountains and low hills and north and southeast and west, and so we've had a good journey on this trip. Today we will be in Jerusalem, which is frequently known as Zion. And the mountain there of Jerusalem is Mount Zion. You'll recall that we did hit one of the mountains there in Jerusalem. You remember with Abraham and Isaac, and we went to Mount Moriah, you'll recall? Well, Mount Moriah is one part of Mount Zion. It's one section of Mount Zion. And Mount Zion can be classified as just one area up on the hill. And you can say this is Mount Zion right here. Many other people will say that Mount Zion really represents all of Jerusalem, all of that area. And some even go farther and say it really represents all of Israel. So when you think about Zion, we're underneath the banner of God, and God is everywhere, not just in one physical location. But it became important for Mount Zion to have a place because it's where the temple was, and the temple had a physical location, of course, where a building resided. And so we have Mount Zion. Now, it's not a really tall one. Last week we talked about Mount Hermon as part of our discussion with Maha, and Mount Hermon is well over 9,000 feet. We've had other mountains that have been a little bit higher. And this mountain with Mount Zion is about 2,500 feet. So it's certainly taller than anything we have here in the Houston area, but it still is not the tallest, but it's still a mountain. And for those of you, I think what seemed like when we show a show of hands for those who have been to Israel, you know that when you go to Mount Zion, you're going up. You're going up. And so it may not be like the tallest mountain in Colorado, but you do go up from that flatland that's down below. And so we'll be traveling up that road today up to Mount Zion, and we'll spend some time there looking into what's going on at Mount Zion. One of the things I want you to think about today is we read Psalm 48. Psalm 48 is talking specifically about Mount Zion, and it's not the only place in the Bible. Mount Zion is mentioned all throughout, from Revelation all the way back into the early parts of the Old Testament, because it was that central place where people gathered and God was there present with the people. So Zion, Mount Zion, has a really important role to play in the Jewish history and for us today too. What I want you to look at as we read through Psalm 48 here in just a moment is to think about this place of Mount Zion and how the person who was writing this psalm, this song, was thinking about the place where they were and what they saw. What I would like you to do is to think about maybe a hometown where you came from, and to think about you putting yourself in that same place about a city, a town, and what it meant to you. Cities, towns have a presence, don't they? They have a calling for people who see that city. Does it have high soaring buildings? Are they low buildings like on a main street made out of wood and stone? What does that look like, and what does it say to somebody? Is this a working class city, or is this a high finance city with gleaming glass and aluminum and steel? What does that city say to you? And our person who wrote this song today is describing that very thing that we would think about when we see a city. It says, look here. Let's look over here. What do we see here? Now let's turn around. Let's look back here. What do we see over here? And so if you can think about Rick Steves, anyone follow Rick Steves? Yep. Or even Ed and Bev Robb as they make a tour to Israel. When you think about a tour guide, what's the purpose of a tour guide? It's to help you understand something about where you are. You've likely not been there or may not have been to that particular place. So you get some background, you get some history, you begin to get a context of the culture. You see things that are important, maybe the things that every tourist has to go to, but there may be some things down a back road or an alley that most people wouldn't know if you didn't have a tour guide. And in our song today, we have a tour guide of the city of Zion up on the mountain. And they'll be pointing out things to us that we need to look for and how God relates to us and how we relate to God. And so let's do this first. Let's read Psalm 48 before we hike here. And I want you to listen to what the person who wrote this song, this psalm, is saying as they are a guide for us. Think about this person holding up the umbrella. And you're following behind as they walk around the city. And they're asking you to look at things. And we'll talk about the things that the tour guide is wanting us to look at. So if you can look at Psalm 48, we will see what our tour guide and our songwriter says to us about this. In Psalm 47, leading up to it, it's a long, great discussion in Psalm 48 about God being praiseworthy and singing praises to God. And as we transition then into Psalm 48, now we're thinking about the city where God resides, His holy place. And Psalm 48 says, it starts out in my Bible, maybe it says in yours too, a psalm of the sons of Korah. Does your Bible say that too? It talks about the sons of Korah. I'll stop just for a second before we read Psalm 48. Does the name Korah sound familiar to you? For those of you who made the hike all the way from Sinai up to the Promised Land in that great book of Numbers, you'll remember in Numbers 16, Korah was the highlight of that chapter. You remember what Korah did? Yes, absolutely right. Korah and a few of his buddies thought that he knew a whole lot better than Moses, and he said, I'm tired of this wandering around. We're getting absolutely nowhere. Let's go back to Egypt. We sure liked Egypt when we were in slavery. Let's go back there. And God says, when you are challenging my prophet Moses, that's the same thing as challenging me, God, because he is speaking my words to you. And when you rebel against Moses, you're rebelling against God. And it was a very dramatic story about God saying, Moses and all you people, get back, get away from Korah, stand back. And the earth opened up and swallowed him alive. You remember that? Because of his rebellion against Moses, but more importantly against God. So we have in this psalm now the sons of Korah, a man who was rebellious and was swallowed alive for his disobedience and leading the people astray. So something must have happened along the line where his descendants, the descendants of Korah, which were in the line of the Levites, the priests, something must have happened as a result of Korah being swallowed alive like that, where they got religion, if you will. And they followed the true and the living God, and now they're recorded forever in the Bible. It's a wonderful story of redemption, that just because your parents may do something doesn't mean it has to carry on down through the descendants, down through the years. So the sons of Korah now are going to talk to us about not the rebellion like their ancestor Korah, but about God, the mighty God who lives here in Zion. So here's his song. And think about these people as he's a tour guide holding the umbrella up and the tour guide's walking around. And it says it's a song. They're singing this song as they walk around this beautiful place of Zion. The psalmist says, great is the Lord and most worthy of praise in the city of our God, his holy mountain. It's beautiful in its loftiness, the joy of the whole earth. Like the utmost heights of Zaphon is Mount Zion, the city of the great King. God is in her citadels. He has shown himself to be her fortress. When the kings joined forces, when they advanced together, they saw her and were astounded. They fled in terror. Trembling seized them there, pain like that of a woman in labor. You destroyed them like ships of Tarshish, shattered by an east wind. As we have heard, so have we seen in the city of the Lord Almighty, in the city of our God. God makes her secure forever. Within your temple, O God, we meditate on your unfailing love. Like your name, O God, your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is filled with righteousness. Mount Zion rejoices. The villages of Judah are glad because of your judgments. Walk about Zion. Go around her. Count her towers. Consider well her ramparts. View her citadels, that you may tell of them to the next generation. For this is God, our God, forever and ever, and he will be our guide even to the end. Do you get that sense of walking around Zion, singing this song, and get to see this beautiful city and all that God has provided for them, the protection, the fortress, the citadel, the ramparts, and the safety and security, even against these armies that are aligned and coming to sweep through that area, that God will protect his people that are there. I think it's a beautiful story. And so one of the things that I think about too in this selection of Psalm 48 is possibly a slogan for this area of Zion, Mount Zion, the city, the holy mountain of God. I've got a few slides where I want you to think about this, again, when you think about your town and how you might look at that. Just like the armies may have looked at that as they were marching up toward the city. And think about how we have slogans on our cities. Houston had a great slogan at one time, it was very creative. It said, "Houston's hot." You remember that? But cities have slogans to try to define themselves. So when people think about a town, they have some interest in what's going on, or they get a hint into what's taking place. And the marketing people have an opportunity to give a kind of a vision of what that city should look like. And what I see here in Psalm 48, I think the sons of Korah put down a slogan as well for Mount Zion, and it's in verse 2. "It's beautiful in its loftiness, the joy of the whole earth." That's a pretty good slogan, isn't it? Beautiful in its loftiness, the joy of the whole earth. It's not just a city like Houston or a place where you're from that's just for that area. The joy of the whole earth, it's for all. So let me let you look at some things that I thought of that might help you put you in this place. So when you see this slogan that Houston did, energy capital of the world, what do you think? If you were an outsider and you're going to a convention in Houston, but you've never been to Houston before, and on the literature you got, there was this slogan. And it said this, energy capital of the world for Houston. What would you think about Houston? Is this a beach resort? Likely not. What are the kind of people who would gravitate toward the energy capital of the world? Oil and gas? Okay. You said it's not a resort, so probably a working class kind of town, I would think, involved in energy, right? And you can see down at the bottom, you see the silhouette, the outline of the city. So it's a big city. This is not a little burg somewhere. This is a big city. What do you think about this? What would that tell you if you got this in the mail and you wanted to go to New York City and it's a city never sleeps? There's a lot going on. You won't have any problem finding something to do. But now you also notice buildings, don't you? Tall buildings, all of them reaching, one higher than the next. You see what looks like a lot of concrete and stone and glass, and this is a big city, a lot of people who are there. So what do you think about this, the city of light? Actually, what's right in the middle? The Eiffel Tower. And you see a glass of wine, right? So does this give you a different feel than, say, the city that never sleeps or the energy capital? Glass of wine, beautifully lit at night. You've got a nice dome there. This is going to be a lot of fun. This is a great place to go to. A lot of culture, entertainment. A wonderful place to go and be able to spend some time there. What about this? So if you're going to Vegas, do you have an idea of what's going to happen there? Yeah, nothing you can talk about. You'll never be able to share what happened there, but you might have a good time in Vegas. What about that? Does that have a little bit different feel than the big skyscrapers of New York City? This has something about some age, doesn't it? This is an architectural design that goes back a long way, and so you've got a lot of history here, a lot of beauty. You may notice, too, up at the very top that there's some inscriptions there. You've probably seen inscriptions on buildings before. It tells something about the building, maybe how old it is or what happens in that building. So there's something that they want to project as well. And then, of course, you see the fountains there in Rome. Beautiful place to go. Now, what does this tell you? Chicago, city of the big shoulders. And then they just had to add in some extra stuff there. Stormy and husky and brawling. Is this a place you want to go? But this is a city slogan, yeah. And what do you see with this guy who's there? He's got some big, heavy work boots on. He's got his hand doubled up with a fist. Shirt sleeves are rolled up. Man, this guy's ready for action, carrying a steel I-beam on his shoulder. He's smiling. He loves it. He loves the brawling, yeah, and the strength, the city of the big shoulders. So this is in Bucharest, capital of Romania, Paris of the East. Says something again about its age and what it wants to project to the world. City of culture, city of beauty. What's this say? All right, so who's from Austin? Or who lived in Austin or went to school in Austin? We got a few, all right, a few UT folks, yep. I think this pretty well speaks for itself, doesn't it? It says just about everything you need to know about Austin. Great town. And then what about this? Music City. I also noticed something at the bottom of this one. It said it was established in 1779, so right after our country declared independence, Nashville's been around. So it's got some age to it, but it also has roots from the country and music. So do you see how cities describe themselves and project themselves and say to others who are coming, this is who we are. We're the city of big shoulders. We're brawling. We're husky. And you've got other places that say, what happens here stays here. Others that say, it's kind of weird here, but it's fun. Cities have a character, don't they? And it's not just in the slogans, but it's what that town represents. And so when you then compare some of these great slogans done by the Chamber of Commerce out of these towns, and then you compare that with the slogan that you see in verse 2 of chapter 48, it's beautiful in its loftiness, the joy of the whole earth. Did you get that sense from any of these other slogans from the cities? Beautiful in its loftiness, the joy of the whole earth. No, the cities were focused on themselves and what that city had to offer, not the whole earth, but them. And this is what we do in this city, and this is what we look like in this city. It would be just the same for the people back in the time when Korah wrote this psalm. They had towns just like we have towns. They looked different depending if it was small or large. Had architecture out of their area using the materials that they could come up with, the stone and others that they could draw from, and they all had a look. Jerusalem had a look. Jerusalem was on a hill. But our psalmist is saying this is not just a city with some buildings made out of stone, overlaid with some gold, and it's up on a hill. This is a city that's beautiful. Why is it beautiful? Because this is the city where the God of the universe resides. And this God of the universe resides in this city is the joy of the whole earth. It's for all, not just the people who happen to live here, but it's for all, the joy of the whole earth. So I love the way the psalmist has addressed what's taking place here. Do you notice, too, in verse 3, after he talks about these heights and the city of the great king, about citadels and fortresses? I've got a picture. We'll look at that in just a moment. But you do get a strong sense of something that is protected. That when you are in this city and you're with this God, there is a fortress and a citadel and ramparts. You get a very strong sense of something that's heavily fortified. Nothing's coming through here. So when you come into this city, this is a city of safety and refuge and protection and security. This is a place that you want to be. At the end of verse 2, it says, like the utmost heights of Zaphon is Mount Zion. Zaphon is a really big mountain. Not as big as Hermon, but it's twice the size of Mount Zion. And it's located north of Israel on the border of Syria and Turkey. And this mountain is a huge mountain that butts right up against the Mediterranean Sea. And we'll take a look at it here. So why in the world, if we're talking about this city of God, the mountain of God in Zion, in Jerusalem, in Israel, the joy of the whole earth, why does our psalmist here say it's like the utmost heights of Zaphon? Why is there a comparison there? Do you recall when we looked at Mount Carmel a few weeks ago, and you remember Elijah took upon the Baal and the Baal prophets? You remember that? And there were 850 of these prophets up on Mount Carmel going against one person, Elijah. And Elijah had the holy God, the prophets had their Baal God, and you may recall that the importance of the Baal God was that he was in charge of rain and lightning and fertility. So where the Baal God was located was near water, like Mount Carmel. Right, it's by Haifa, right on the Mediterranean Sea. And there was a high place there for the Baal God. Well, here we have a mountain that's twice as high as Mount Zion, and you can see the water right on the sea, high mountain. This is the home that they believed was the home of the Baal God. And so in our text today, the psalmist is saying, this is a much larger mountain than Mount Zion. And it's the home of their Baal God, this God of fertility and life and rain. And the psalmist is saying, You can look at these heights of Zaphon and the Baal god, and it looks imposing and powerful and twice as big as Zion. But in our city with our God, all of the other pagan gods that may look to be even more powerful on higher mountains than God still pale in comparison to our God who is in this city on the mountain of God. So he's trying to make a comparison to those people who would see the city of Zion and say, well, this is not near as tall as Hermon, or it's not near as tall as Mount Zaphon. And the psalmist is saying, when you look at these other mountains around here with their pagan gods, they pale in comparison to what we have. And what we have here in our city of Zion is a place of security and a fortress and a place of protection where people would want to come. Zaphon and the other pagan gods are places that we've already shown because of Carmel are places of an impotent God, a God who is not there, a God only that people worship as pagans, but not the true God that we have in Mount Zion. So going into 4, it says, when the kings joined forces and they advanced together, they saw her and were astounded and then fled in terror. So you can imagine when you have a small community of the Israelites and you have all of the other tribes and armies from surrounding communities, that they would say, well, let's go down and we'll take Mount Zion. It's not much. They're on a hill and it's not really a warrior people. These are estranged people that are there. And all the kings banded together, and it says they advanced. And as they came down the road going toward Mount Zion, they saw this beautiful city, the city on the hill, and they were astounded. What they thought was going to be easy pickings among some people who was not a warrior tribe, that they were going to sweep right in there and take over Mount Zion and plunder the temple and wipe them out. And it said they were astounded by what they saw, and then they fled in terror. Trembling seized them there, pain like that of a woman in labor. You destroyed them like the ships of Tarshish, shattered by an east wind. Another comparison to the sea, the Mediterranean, that Israel borders up over on the west coast. And these ships would come across the Mediterranean Sea, be blown by the winds and wipe them out. And he said, it's just like an east wind wiping out these ships. It's like a woman who's in pain. Trembling seized them. They fled in terror, and the kings left. They saw that they were mighty on this earth, but when they got near the mountain, the city of God, where the holy God is located with the fortress, they were nothing in comparison. Beautiful that they saw, and then it turned to terror, and they ran. And in 8 it says, as we have heard, so we have seen. In the city of the Lord Almighty, in the city of our God, God makes her secure forever. You get that sense of security again. The city of the Lord Almighty, the city of our God, God makes her secure forever. So we've seen this citadel, tower, ramparts, fortress. In ancient times, there were these fortresses that had multiple levels of defense. You could have earthworks outside that would slow armies down as they come up to you. Being on a hill is really important because you're above the people who are going to try to get you. And going uphill, when you are an attacking army, it's a bad place to be. So you're on a hill, you've got some rock walls, then you have higher rock walls, you see towers so people can look and see who's coming. The citadel is the fortress inside the walls, so even if the walls are breached, there's a citadel, a fortress even inside there that people fall back into for even greater protection. Do you get that sense with God that there's multiple levels here of protection that He provides to us? And all the enemies out there that are advancing, like we see with the armies advancing, that they'll never penetrate all of the things that are set up here. The ramparts where people are watching. Towers where they're able to spy on what's going on. Citadel, the fortress inside the fortress. Layer upon layer upon layer. This idea with God of protection and security. Nothing will get to us. It's His city. And it says in 8, God makes her secure forever. Let's take a picture here. This may look familiar to you for those who have been to Israel. And you can see then Zion in the Mount of Olives. And again, many people consider Zion just to be really all of this area around Jerusalem. But do you see the roads that are winding up? Again, you get the feeling of we got to go up to get to this hill, up on the hill, this mountain where we're going. We're going up. And we're going up toward the temple. And so in verse 9 it says, within your temple, O God, we meditate on your unfailing love. So where is God? God's in the temple. God's in the temple on His holy mountain. And what are we doing as we're walking? We're meditating. We're thinking about God and what He has done for us. Like your name, O God, your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. So we're praising God. We're meditating. We're praising God. Your right hand is filled with righteousness. And then in 11, Mount Zion rejoices. The villages of Judah are glad because of your judgments. So as you're making your way up and you're going to the city, you see this building that you see. We're meditating. We're thinking about what God has done, the security that we have when we're with God. We're praising Him for all that He's done to give us this security. We're rejoicing. We're thankful for what we have there with God. And Mount Zion rejoices. And we're glad because of your judgments. Now listen to this as we think about our tour guide. Then in verse 12. Walk about Zion. Go around her. Count her towers. There's one of the towers there. Walk about, go around her, count her towers, consider well her ramparts, view her citadels, that you may tell of them to the next generation. For this God is our God forever and ever, and He will be our guide even to the end. Do you get a sense of security? Do you get a sense of a city that's different than the others? We're telling people to come and look and see what we have, and this God is protecting us, providing security for us forever and ever, and He will be our guide even to the end. God is there in His temple. We've got a place where we go and we meet God. This has been the theme all the way through the Old Testament, certainly up into this time of the Psalms, and on into where we are today, where we have God who came at Mount Sinai. That's one of the mountains we visited. God meets with Moses, provides the tablets, His covenant with the people, and then He came down in a cloud. And the people built a tabernacle where God's representation would be there in that tabernacle. It was a temporary home because it's a tent, and you could take it with you as you traveled along the road going toward Canaan, but God was with them. And now we have God still with them, but it's in a permanent area now. Now we have a temple. We made a transition from the temporary tent while we're on the road traveling, and now we have the permanent. But it's still the same God with His people, providing that security and protection for them. I'm going to hold right there just for a second. I want Abby to spend a moment, if you would, Abby, and tell us how we're doing on our journey and what we can expect here.
Okay. So I'm resisting doing this whole spoiler thing of what's fixing to happen with the story, but I got a little ambitious and a little anxious this past week. We are on baby watch in my family. My third oldest daughter is due tomorrow, like officially, to have baby number 2, okay? And so this whole, they think they're going to have it 2 weeks early, of course. So we've been, for the past 2 weeks, eating the things that you do to encourage labor and driving down the bumpy roads, all of that kind of stuff. So my part of it is to drop and roll, basically, whenever she calls and says, come and get the firstborn, and Mina's at the hospital, and all that stuff. So I didn't want this mountain to go unfinished. So this is our Mount Zion. We've got a color of purple at the top. This circle is our significant mountaintop illustration of greatness. A royal city sitting on top of a hill. This is different from a man saying, I'm building a royal city, and it's super fine, and it's Houston's hot, right? Or something like that. It's fantastic from my perspective or your perspective. But what makes this one great is from God's perspective. This is a city on a hill, worthy. So we're going to add a little bit of a divinity thing to this. But from this point this week, going into the lesson, because I really do need to hear what Steve's got to say before I had those finishing touches and which direction he winds up going. But I think that we need to have a little bit more of a symbolic representation of this city on the hill that brings the divine where He meets the human heart and soul. So that will be coming. In the meantime, we've got sun rays that, and we've got the glory of God up over the mountain. And then next week we'll have a little synopsis of all the mountains and their significance. Thank you to those that brought their little tchotchkes this week. We have about 6 or 8 more to add to our work, and it's beautiful. I really appreciate all the stories. There's not one story that's more significant than the next. Each of you has a mountaintop moment. And it's pure and it's genuine and it's authentic, and it doesn't matter if it's bigger than someone else's or less than in someone else's eyes. It's yours, and you have the right to own it, and I'm just so pleased that you're sharing those with us. So thank you.
That's a good lead-in for next week, is that our plan is that we've gone through these 6 mountains now, and we thought next week would be a summary, a synopsis, as Abby said, that will give us a little bit of a review, but more importantly, will give you an opportunity to share some of your stories. We heard a beautiful story from Maha last week, didn't we? Really bring tears to your eyes in some parts of her story, but all of us have stories. We've seen some shared. Dale shared one, and we've had some others, and we would encourage you to bring your story. If you can say that in front of the class, your story, that would be wonderful. If it's something you just want to write down, like on a 3x5 card, that's okay too. Everyone here has a story. Everyone here has something to say and something to share. And we'd like to hear that from you as we think about going to these mountaintop moments. And we'll talk some more about the mountains next week to conclude. But a lot of what we'd like to do is hear from you and hear what you have experienced in your life through either the salvation or something that's happened in your family or your personal life. That would be a wonderful treat for all of us.
You know, I'm still amazed that the Jewish people were really so little advanced from the pagans, and that the pagans had Baal and Baal lived here. You know, and they've got God living, residing in a city, and the ramparts and all this stuff. But He's here. This, you know, their concept is so less than what our concept is of God. I just never cease to be amazed at that.
Familiarity, I guess, just something you take for granted, possibly. That this is something you see all the time and you get comfortable with it, I think may be part of it, just the human nature. But it's a great point of how did they miss it? But I think it says something about us as well. Do we miss it? Do we miss the point sometimes of what God is doing? Do we see God as someone who is there just for us to answer our prayers and take care of us, or do we see something larger? And so our psalmist today is wanting us to look at something larger. And I think that's why he continues to refer to this mountain of God, this holy city, this beautiful place, something looking beyond ourselves. Well, so we've got a few minutes left. So what I want to do is just take a moment to think about Mount Zion and God being with us and how it has come down through the Bible and how we've seen that shared, because I think it'll help us a little bit to see how God has worked. And maybe to Ken's point of not overlooking God in our midst and taking God for granted in what we see. And I think that's what the psalmist is trying to do. He's trying to stop and say, stop. We're walking around this city, and I want you to spend a moment, and I want you to look at the citadel and what that represents. Now I want you to stop, and I want you to look over here, and I want you to look at this fortress. Okay. Now I want you to look over here for a moment. Take a moment. Look at this rampart. Understand what that means and what God is doing in protection for you. I want you to stop. I want you to think. And you'll then remember where the psalmist says, now I want you to meditate on this. I don't want you just to be a tourist and take a few pictures and then ask the tour guide what time is lunch. Beautiful to see this, but it's not the point of the stone or the tower or the citadel. It's what it represents. So let's meditate on that. What does it mean for us to be in this beautiful city that is the joy of the whole earth? What does that mean? And we're here with this holy God. Let's think about that. Let's not just go on to the next stop and see what's down the next alley. Let's meditate on that. Now that we meditate on it, can we think about praising this God who has put this together? And then once we praise God after we've meditated on it, then let's rejoice over what we see, because look at what God has done for us. Nothing we ever did, it's what God did for us. We should rejoice over that. And so the psalmist is walking us through and saying, slow down, don't overlook it, don't take it for granted. This is the God here. This is His city, it's His mountain, and let's meditate, praise, and then rejoice. Let's take a little tour through the Bible and try to take a look at some of the verses in the Bible that leads us to this point, and then we'll carry us forward. So go back to Exodus 40. Exodus 40 is at the very end of that book of Exodus. Moses is recounting in this book all of the things that's taken place to set up the tabernacle. The tent of meeting. This is the temporary tent when they were coming out of Sinai again to travel, carrying God with them, cloud by day, fire by night. That's the tabernacle, tent of meeting. And so Moses is talking about in chapter 40 about getting this set up and how it's going to look and how do we care for the tent and what goes in the tent, the altar and the dishware and so forth. And so he lays all of that out. In 33, chapter 40, 33, as we get to the very end of the chapter, he's got all of this set up inside the tent. And in 33 it says, Then Moses set up the courtyard around the tabernacle and altar and put up the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard. And so Moses finished the work. Finished getting the tabernacle set just the way God needed it to be set. And in 34, as this book ends, then the cloud, the representation of God, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses couldn't enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all of the travels of the Israelites, wherever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, the fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all of the house of Israel during all of their travels. So we see at the very end of Exodus this beginning part of God coming down, God being with his people, God being part of his people, and he was going to guide them and lead them. So this is where it begins, back in Exodus, coming out of Sinai. Now let's fast forward a little bit and just jump over a few books to 1 Kings. We read a little bit of this in one of our previous studies in one of our mountains. 1 Kings is the description of the handoff from David, the great king, to his son Solomon. And you'll recall, because of David's sin, that he could not complete the temple. It wasn't up to him to build the temple, that was going to be to his son. So 1 Kings records this handoff from David to Solomon, and then Solomon then begins gathering all the materials to build a temple. And all these chapters leading up to chapter 8 are all the furnishings inside there. I don't know if Maha is here today or not, but it refers regularly inside these chapters, going up to Lebanon to get the cedars that were used to build this permanent structure, now the temple. The point is that back in Exodus with Moses, we have a temporary structure, but God was with them, went with them wherever they went. Cloud by day, fire by night. And now they have made it to the promised land, and now there's going to be a permanent structure built to house God, where people can see where God is at his holy mountain. And so in chapter 8, in verse 1, it says, Then King Solomon summoned into the presence of Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. And all the men of Israel came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. So now we have a transition going on, that the ark is going to be removed from the temporary tabernacle. And you recall the ark that resided in the tent had Moses' tablets, the covenant, the 10 commandments were in there. So it says they are bringing up the ark that holds the Lord's covenant, the 10 commandments, and they're going to go to Zion, the city of David. And it continues on, and in verse 12 in chapter 8, 1 Kings, it says, Then Solomon said, The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever. Transition from the temporary to the permanent. God will now be permanently in this temple, in Zion. Solomon then continues on, and he has a wonderful prayer about this transition from his father to himself and the building of the temple. And jump over to verse 27, it says, But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built. So we're going to hold there. If you read the rest of chapter 8, you'll see more about what Solomon was doing and these lengthy prayers he has as part of this dedication. But what I really like about this is that we've had this temporary tent. Now we're moving into the permanent, the temple that he has built. But isn't it wonderful how Solomon says he doesn't take any credit for what he's done? This beautiful building that he was in charge of, he doesn't say, Look at this beautiful building that I built, aren't I a great person? He doesn't say that at all. In fact, he says, I'm not even going to focus on the physical structure of this permanent temple because I recognize that does God really dwell on earth? Can we really contain God inside of this building of stone and cedars and gold? Really? Is that where God is? We've captured him and he's inside here. Does God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple that I have built? What a beautiful recognition that God is with us, has always been with us, but it's not about that tent or this building. God resides. Remember back to our slogan in Psalm 48? This beautiful city, the joy of what? This one building, this physical structure in Jerusalem? The joy of what? The whole earth. And Solomon is recognizing the same thing. Yeah, there's a beautiful building here. Thanks be to God for laying out the maps and the architectural drawings, and we built it. But do I really think that God dwells in that thing? Can't capture God inside of that temple. God is the joy of the whole earth, and Solomon recognized that. Well, we got a couple of minutes left. Let me jump over to the New Testament because I think I want to let you see how this affects us today. That we are not just captured back in a building of stone or up on a beautiful city of Mount Zion, but just as the people saw the tent of meeting and God with them while they were going through the desert, and now in the permanent area of the temple, the Bible in the New Testament says a lot about us as well. So if you'll jump over to Matthew 28, we will take a look at the very end of that book as well. And in Matthew 28, right at the very end, Jesus is talking to his disciples. And in verse 16, very into Matthew, it says, Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And then Jesus came to them and said, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And listen to this, very last sentence. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. What did the psalmist say in Psalm 48? Very last sentence. For this God is our God forever and ever. He will be our guide, even to the end. Sounds just like Matthew, doesn't it? This eternal God who has always been with his people, whether it's temporary or permanent. And now Jesus in this great commission is going into his disciples and said, Don't fear. I'm still with you. And as the psalmist said, I'm going to be with you all the way to the end. All the way to the end. All the way throughout the whole world, I will be with you, care for you. Look at Ephesians in chapter 2. Let's see what Paul says about this same idea. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. Paul says, Consequently, you're no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household. This idea of a building and a structure, in the New Testament, Paul is now saying it's us. It's each one of us. We are the stones built upon the foundation of Christ. We're no longer aliens and foreigners, fellow citizens with God's people, members of God's household. Somehow God adopts us into his family. We're in that household. And then he says we're built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a what? A holy temple of the Lord. Do you see yourself in that? We're now children of God. We're part of the stones on his foundation. Part of the stones of this holy temple, not a physical building in the Middle East, which is beautiful, but it's in one place. Our slogan, beautiful city, a joy to the whole earth, and we too become a holy temple in the Lord. We're part of that. I'll do one more, and then we'll close. Let's look at Revelation. Go to the very last book and see how it ends. We kind of jump to the end, and we get to see how the movie turns out. In Revelation 21, that whole chapter is all about the New Jerusalem. John, the author, is painting this picture of what it will be like one day. What will it look like one day? This Jerusalem, this Mount Zion we've been talking about here, place that was built for God, this beautiful city. John says, chapter 21 in Revelation, Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. There was no longer any sea, and I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men. The dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning, crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Jump down to verse 10. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God. Its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, 12 angels at the gates, and on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then jump over to verse 22. I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. Can you see the transition from the temporary, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, to the permanent that Solomon made? And now, look at, we are part of this temple. And John says this new heaven has come down. And he says it's not a building anymore. It's God and Jesus, the Lamb. They're the temple. That's what we're worshiping. And it says the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light. The Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light. The kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. Oh, on no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. And that's where we are, in the Lamb's book of life. Not looking at a building, but now God and his Son, the Lamb, are the temple. No more day, no more night. This radiant light coming out. It's a beautiful picture of where we are, and we're part of that. We're part of that temple. So I liked our tour guide in our psalm today that paused and said, stop and think for a moment about what you're seeing. Don't just get enraptured by stones and the glitter and the glamour and all of that, but stop and think for a moment about our place and what that temple represents, and that we serve a God who has always been with his people. Always. Whether it was in a cloud or on a mountain or wherever he was with his people, and now it says he's with us. And no more is it a physical place, but God and the Lamb are the temple, and we're worshiping that God and the Lamb. Isn't that a great story about Mount Zion? It's a good way to end our journey here on the mountains. So next week, if you will, bring a 3x5 card, something that may have meant something to you, a mountaintop moment, someplace where God spoke to you. We've had a lot of people bring little items, and those are fine. Abby will be able to work those in. But we'd like for you to have a little bit of time, for those who would like to be able to share a little bit about your story and what God's done for you. So think about that next week. Well, let's close with a word of prayer. Father, thank you for the book that you've given us, the words that you have, and we just rejoice, Father, to know that you are the temple, the holy temple, Father. And we think about, as they looked at this building, this joy of the whole earth, beautiful city of God. And Father, we just thank you for caring enough for us to send your Son and redeemed us, Father, and we now are part of that holy temple worshiping you. And we just ask this week that we will go through this week meditating, thinking about you, praising you, Father, and then rejoicing for that salvation. And we ask it in your name. Amen.